Russian ground forces and military vehicles crossed into Ukraine.
Indian Prime Minister has spoken to the Russian President Vladimir Putin, also appealed for an immediate cessation of the violence.
The fact, though, is that Putin's attack on Ukraine has got India walking a tightrope amidst its strong diplomatic ties with both Russia and the United States.
New Delhi is under immense pressure to take a stand.
Russia is a key supplier of weapons and spares. It is also India's key diplomatic link to Afghanistan and Central Asia.
Russia and Ukraine both have been among our first 10 countries in terms of tourism into Sri Lanka. So it has been really, really difficult for the Sri Lankans.
As far as the people of Pakistan are concerned, we are just tired and exhausted of conflict. We're very wary of being drawn into another forever war.
Why is the global south taking a neutral position? They regard this as a proxy war between Russia and the United States over Ukrainian bodies. They're saying we don't want to take part in it.
Somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems.
Welcome to Beyond the Indus with your hosts Joe Wallen and Tushar Shetty. And this episode, we're going to talk about the Ukraine war from a different perspective. It's been more than a year since the conflict began, and we're going to dive deep into how it's affected countries in South Asia, how do people here view the conflict, and talk about the wider strategic, economic, and geopolitical factors involved. But before we dive into that, Joe, what have you been up to?
Yeah, all good with me on my side. I'm currently on my way heading down to Kerala. The news that India is overtaking China has been one of the big headlines when it comes to population this week. It's the first time since 1950 China hasn't been the world's most populous country. A lot of talk in the media about kind of job creation, about sort of further strains on sort of public sector infrastructure in India, so looking at education or health. But what a lot of people aren't aware of is actually that the elderly population in India, those over the age of 60, that's set to increase by 40% over the next decade, which is a huge demographic shift. So on my way to Kochi to look into that topic, which should be fascinating. But what's been piquing your interest in the news this week, Tish?
Well, so once in a while, you come across an article that sort of cuts through all the clutter and gets to the heart of the issue in a way that helps you understand the entire scenario better. And I recently found one of these in the Times of India op-ed section that was talking about the upcoming Karnataka elections. So for foreign listeners, Karnataka is a state in the south, and it's a very, very important state in the BJP. They currently are in government, but they are set to lose a historic election that's happening sometime in this year, the coming year. And basically, Karnataka is a state that Bangalore is in. It's one of the largest and richest states in India. But the BJP traditionally has not done well in South India. So it's very important that they retain at least one state in that region. Basically, the article went into why they have messed up their entire election strategy. And the reason for this is because in Karnataka, you have these two major castes that have these influential temples called mutts. And these mutts are not just spiritual centers. They sort of organize education, charity, food distribution. They're very much community centers of power, right? And anyone who's in power in that state has to manage it really well. Now, the previous Karnataka CM, Yediyurappa, who was part of the BJP, was very good at this. But the problem is the BJP is not good at sharing power. It's sort of like the Amazon or the Walmart coming into a town and sort of making all the other businesses go out of competition. It's like your one-stop shop for everything to do with internationalism. So what they did is they sort of downplayed Yediyurappa. They tried to create religious tensions by issues like banning the hijab from colleges. They tried to demonize a very, very historically important king in the region called Tipu Sultan, who happened to be Muslim. And this does not seem to have worked. Basically, the caste that Yediyurappa belonged to, the biggest caste in Karnataka, are upset with the BJP because they feel like they've demeaned it. And the second largest caste actually considers Tipu Sultan a hero. So the BJP was trying to create this small historical movie about how Tipu Sultan was killed by people of this caste. And the head of the largest mutt, the temple, came out and said, please don't do this. You're insulting our community. So it's interesting because we tend to see this entire Hindu nationalism narrative as this one unified force. And I think the country is so diverse and so many interesting nuances in this story that come out really well in this particular op-ed.
It's fascinating. I mean, I think we've come to see the BJP as this sort of electoral machine. But a couple of recent knockbacks. I mean, we saw Congress defeat the BJP in a state election in the north of the country, in Himachal Pradesh, and the AAP defeating the BJP in Punjab. So yeah, got a third bloody nose for the party, potentially. Would really send ripples ahead of the general election next year. Now, from my side, I've been following this week, not just the return or the arrival of the Backstreet Boys into Mumbai, which has really dominated the headlines here over the last couple of days, but a more somber story that I've been focused on this week, off the back of some brilliant reporting from the BBC in Afghanistan. We talk about forgotten crises later in this podcast when it comes to Sri Lanka, but Afghanistan is another one that's sort of really fallen away from the headlines with Ukraine. Now, the United Nations has only received around 5% of its aid funding for this year and has warned that it would have to really scale back its operations. Now, 97% of Afghans are now thought to be living below the poverty line. The BBC visited Gore province, which is to the east of Kabul, the one hospital in the region, and just found young children dying from a whole host of preventable diseases. And I think, to me, reading the story, it really pulled on the heartstrings. I mean, this is a topic that has really fallen away sort of from the headlines. I'd encourage all of our listeners to read the BBC's report from Gore, to re-engage with some of these key issues from Afghanistan. Okay, so now on to our main topic this week. Tushar and I were lucky enough to be invited onto the Telegraph's award-winning Latest in Ukraine podcast with David Knowles, Francis Dearnley and Don Nichols to discuss the view from South Asia on the war in Ukraine. There's a lot of misunderstanding in the West, whether in the United States, in the United Kingdom or across Europe, as to why India, Pakistan and other nations in South Asia have abstained from voting against Russia at the United Nations. So we thought we'd dive deeper. We had a lot of listeners email us to say they were interested in the topic and wanted to know more. So not only to give our own insight, but also to match up this week with a couple of the region's best geopolitical thinkers. So that's what we're doing. We're going to dive into Ukraine, both looking at the view from South Asia and also the impact of the war in Ukraine on the region here itself. Stay tuned. Okay, so for this week, our first guest is the Hindu's diplomatic affairs editor, Suhasini Haider, one of India's most well-respected journalists, a real thinking head when it comes to looking at India's policies around the world. Now, Suhasini was as a natural guest for this episode. I mean, I'm sure many of you tune in to Suhasini's YouTube show, a weekly show, Worldview, in which she's discussed previously at length the relationship between India and Russia, the historic relationship between India and Russia. So when it came to this episode, we were very keen to have Suhasini on as a guest. So welcome to Beyond the Indus, Suhasini.
Thanks for having me on, Joe, and thank you, Tushar.
Fantastic. And I understand that you're in Goa at the moment. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, unfortunately, this is not a vacation. This is a working trip to Goa. I'm here actually for a very interesting meeting of foreign ministers of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And for those particularly in the West, as we call it in Europe, in the US, see India essentially as a part of organizations like the Quad or other organizations with the United States, with the EU. It may surprise them to know that India is also a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes Russia, China, 4 Central Asian states, and Pakistan. So the foreign ministers of those countries are meeting here in Goa on Friday. But it is certainly an interesting point to be here because remember, this is a run-up to a probable summit where Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and the other leaders will come to Delhi in July this year.
Absolutely. I think that the eyes of the world are very much on Goa. As you say, business, not pleasure at the moment there. It's a really interesting time, as you say, for SCO members. So I think many of our listeners will be keeping an eye on the conference there. I mean, first things first, I think for me, one of the most surprising things since the start of the war in Ukraine, for something the reaction from the West has been surprised there about India's stance and the fact that India hasn't taken this sort of unilateral stance with the US and its allies. And instead, the country, I think, is best described as taking a position of strategic ambivalence. Kind of what exactly is India's position on when it comes to Russia? And could you explain this concept of strategic ambivalence to our listeners?
Well, I think if you were to ask the Indian government, they'd certainly say they see themselves as neutral, as non-aligned in a sense in this war in the Ukraine. The government has, from pretty much February 24th, made it clear that it had its own priorities in the war. To begin with, its priority was basically to bring out about 20,000 Indians, mostly students, who were stuck inside conflict zones inside Ukraine. For that, they needed to be on good talking terms to both the powers that be in Moscow and in Kiev. After that, they started to talk about the idea that India needed to secure its energy security. It needed to secure its food security, fertilizer issues as well. So a lot of India's diplomatic heft, if you like, has gone in the last year to ensuring that these supply chains remain open. And they've been badly hit by Russia's war in Ukraine, followed by the sanctions by about 39 countries, including the United States, the EU, and others. And then the third part has been India's sort of very, very hesitant foray into trying to be some kind of a message deliverer / mediator in the conflict. The truth is that India has kept its lines open to both Moscow and Kiev, but Prime Minister Modi has met with Putin. He has not met with President Zelensky. The foreign minister has been several times, to Moscow. The NSA has been, the defense minister has been. They've hosted Russian ministers in India. They have not hosted Ukrainian ministers at a ministerial level in India. Neither has any Indian big delegation gone to Kiev. So there is a difference in the way they're approaching the two of them. However, we do speak to also Western diplomats who maybe a year ago were really quite, sort of optimistic that India would join their side of the fence, who now say, well, we're happy if India keeps some of the lines open to Moscow and passes on some of the messages we want. Of course, the US and the EU have significantly climbed down on the kind of threats they made a year ago when it came to India buying Russian oil. That was an unexpected bump in the sort of leap in the India-Russia relationship as well. So what we've seen essentially is India taking the stand that we don't want to take sides in the Ukraine war, but we want to ensure that we are not hurt, and we want to also represent the global South, countries that should not be hurt by either the war or the sanctions as well.
Yes, I think there was sort of real concern almost in the West when a month into the war, this is March 2022, we saw Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, make a visit to Delhi, and this was quite widely condemned. But for what a lot of our listeners maybe don't realise, I think certainly a lot of Western policymakers don't realise, is that India and Russia have this historic relationship that goes back decades. I mean, Jaishankar, the Indian foreign minister, described it as the most stable of all kind of major economic partnerships. I mean, are you able to explain to our listeners how or what India and Russia's historic relationship entails?
Well, Joe, it is a fact that India has for decades had a very close relationship with the Soviet Union. There are many reasons for this. But in the Cold War, if you like, the US definitely chose partners that weren't India, including a security partnership with Pakistan. India had good ties with Moscow from the very beginning, from its independence. But it wasn't until 1971 when things really got much closer. Because India and the Soviet Union signed what was called a friendship treaty that they signed in 1971. Of course, it was signed just months before the war that led to the independence of Bangladesh, where Indian soldiers fought Pakistani soldiers eventually and helped liberate Bangladesh. That was a war again where the US chose to stand with Pakistan. In fact, at one point, the US even sent in a fleet in the Indian Ocean, supposedly to threaten India. At that time, the fact that the Soviet Union sort of backed India and certainly was in this cooperation agreement has always held very heavy over India's conceptualization of its relationship with Moscow. Now, you might ask that if in 1971 it was the Soviet Union that India tied up with, then that included both Russia and Ukraine. So why is India showing its support for Moscow instead? And I think it is because of the kind of relationship that developed after. It was a very close political relationship, one between the governments, but it was also a big defense relationship. And until about 2011 or 12, India got most of its defense hardware from Russia. Even today, if you were to look at India's hardware dependency on Russia, it ranges around 50 to 60%. but the dependency on its spare parts is close to much more. It's actually closer to 80%. Finally, if you look at transfer of technology, and in this new age, when you look at transfer of technology, it is only Moscow that actually does any kind of transfer of technology. So this is something that India has been speaking to European countries about. It has been speaking to the United States about, but so far nothing has happened. Finally, in this entire supply chain, if you like, of defense hardware, there are India's defense exports, and its biggest headline item of defense exports is something called the BrahMos missile, and it literally stands for the Brahmaputra Moskva, the two rivers, one in India and one in Russia. So you can see that they are linked. They're very lockstep when it comes to defense hardware imports into India, even though obviously this relationship is under a lot of strain since the Ukraine war for obvious reasons. Russia is using its defense hardware really for its own war, not being able to export as much. India is unable to pay for a lot of this because of the sanctions. And it is a relationship that is fraying somewhat. But there are other parts to that traditional relationship. There's also India's energy dependence. And by that, it isn't that India used to buy Russian oil in the past. In fact, in the past, Russia was about 17th on the list of countries exporting to India. Today, Russia has been number one for the last few months. India has become, as of December, Russia's biggest importer of oil. One of the reasons that India has been doing this is, of course, as you pointed out, keeping prices in India stable. Energy prices in India are stable. But what we've also done, and this was a story the Hindu worked on this week, we were looking at a report out of Helsinki that essentially called India one of 5 laundromat companies, accusing India, China, Turkey, UAE, and Singapore of actually buying so much Russian oil that they weren't using it all internally for domestic purposes, but were actually exporting a large amount of it as crude products that had been refined in Indian refineries. One of those refineries is actually 50% or nearly 50% owned by Rosneft, the Russian oil company. India also has stakes in Russian oil and gas fields, about $16 billion worth of it. And then when you come to the nuclear energy part of the equation, again, Russia is the only country that actually operates and constructs foreign nuclear power plants in India. So even though one might have heard a lot about the United States-India civil nuclear deal, for example, there aren't actually any American nuclear power plants in India, nor a French one, although one is being planned. For a number of these reasons, we have seen the relationship between the two countries come very, very close over a number of decades. Finally, and this is the big question that many ask, and in fact, I have to be honest, because I myself was surprised, as you pointed out, that India had not yet, in a sense, said anything about the act of the invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign neighbor. To date, India has not issued any such statement. To date, India has voted to abstain, has actually abstained from voting over about 25 votes at the United Nations, the UNGA, the UNSC, Human Rights Council, IAEA, on none of the resolutions that sought to criticize Russia, whether they were resolutions that were seen as fairly mild, that basically asked for humanitarian access in Ukraine where civilians were being bombed, others on the nuclear issue as well, nuclear safety issue. On none of them has New Delhi, has the Modi government actually voted. They have abstained from all those votes. And one of the reasons for that has been the kind of support India has always received from Soviet Union and then Russia in the Security Council. As a permanent member, Russia has always held a huge, a lot of power with the veto. And India has counted on Moscow to, in a sense, ensure that no resolutions at the Security Council come to criticize India, particularly on issues like Jammu and Kashmir. So it's for a whole number of reasons. Obviously, the sum of the part over here is really much greater than the whole. You still see the kind of closeness in ties regardless of which government comes to power.
Yeah, and as you were speaking about the 1971 war, even as the US sent their USS Enterprise aircraft carrier fleet and ships with that, Russia actually, I was reading in a book, sent part of the Pacific fleet of nuclear submarines. And there was apparently a tense moment where the commanders were issued instructions that if the Americans cross a certain line in the Indian Ocean, then the Soviet submarines have permission to fire upon them. It's almost a Cuban Missile Crisis style crisis. And the fact that Russia would extend that much support, not just weapons, not just intelligence, not just diplomatic support, shows what what kind of ally it has been in the past. But our next question is going to delve into how do we take this relationship in the future? You've outlined some of the ways that Russia still has a good relation with us, both at the UN. They support us economically. Of course, defense is one of the most important variables in there. But considering the current trajectory of where, let's say, Western-Russia relations are going, considering the state of their economy and the state of their diplomatic support after this war, how do you see that relationship progressing? And do you think that there's any strategic value in still having a good relation with Russia? For instance, with respect to China, we hear that we want Russia not to be completely in the Chinese camp. We want to maintain good relationship with them so that they don't end up just becoming completely subordinate to China, at least diplomatically. So where do you think this relationship is going? And what are the reasons you think we should or should not continue this trajectory of maintaining good relations with a state like Russia?
Well, Tushar, what is interesting is that there are reasons that are given by the government for a particular stand, and then there are excuses. So, of course, you will often hear the excuse that India wishes to keep Russia far away from China. However, I think anyone who's been watching the trajectory of Russia-China ties over since 2014, actually, and the Crimean crisis and China's energy deal with Russia at the time that really bailed them out, I think it should be fairly obvious that nothing India is going to do is actually going to, in a sense, create a wider rift between Russia and China. In fact, we've seen European leaders go to Beijing, for example, and impress on China that it should pull away from Russia. India would, of course, like the opposite to happen. But I do think the broader question that you ask is a very important one, because many do believe that given that the Western world that India is so closely aligned with, if you like, ideologically, the idea of coalitions of democracies, the idea of free, pluralistic, democratic countries holding certain values and regard for the international rules-based order would actually stand on the Western side eventually. I think that's been something that's driven Western diplomats for the last year, and you might have watched as foreign minister after foreign minister paraded through Delhi, essentially making exactly the same point, that India must change its stand at the United Nations in its ties with Russia. They have been left disappointed, shall we say, and they have certainly learned to move on from their disappointment and keep their relationship with India. Where does this relationship go? Napoleon once said, show me a country's geography and I'll tell you its history. And I'd only add to that, you can pretty much talk about its foreign policy as well, because India has two realities when it comes to its geography. On the one side, of course, there is this Indo-Pacific reality, the maritime sphere, where it is essentially working with the EU, with the US, with the Quad countries, talking about Indo-Pacific exercises, working on HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief together, working on things like vaccines and all the rest of that. But the large part of India's reality is taken up by its continental realities. And by that, I mean its frontiers with China and with Pakistan. 3,500 kilometers of a line of actual control. It's not even a notified boundary with China. And then another extremely tense line of control with Pakistan and a border with Pakistan as well. Given that reality, India is always going to have to keep a lot of its resources and a lot of its focus on its continental boundaries. And if you look even further north and further west, all the way to Russia, there aren't really any of the allies that we just spoke about. There's no Australia, Japan, and the US and Europe over there. Instead, you have Central Asian countries, you have Pakistan, you have Iran, you have the Gulf countries that are also taking a certain slightly more independent stance during this particular crisis. So you're seeing that India's continental reality is really very much needs for India to have friends in Moscow. So where does this relationship go? I think it still goes exactly as it has gone in the past. Maybe transactionally, you will see a difference. As I said, it might become virtually impossible to do more defense trade between the two countries. India may be looking elsewhere for its defense imports in the short term, certainly. But it does not change the strategic underpinnings of India right now.
It's interesting that you mention EU and Western diplomats were expecting us to back them initially, and now we're sort of making excuses, and they're sort of going through this line of, free and democratic nations. And I do detect a sense of our strategic priorities aren't completely aligned as they might think they are, and perhaps that divergence might cause some conflict in the future. But I do want to ask, in this current scenario, right? We've seen a lot of criticism come from, let's say, the public in the West. Initially, there was some criticism coming from the actual governments considering a stance in Ukraine. But why has the American and European governments so far tolerated or not really made a big deal about India's stance in the Ukraine war? And do you think that's going to stay the same, or do you see, the trends changing? Do you think there might be a slightly stronger response in the future?
I could make the case that India has actually made its case very convincingly over the last year to the US and to Europe that why it needs to keep its stand on Russia, and for all the reasons that we've just been discussing so far. I could also make the case that India has, in the past year, shown the West that not everyone, in fact, most of the rest of the world is not exactly with them. Why do I say this? Because while 140 countries in the UN General Assembly voted to criticize Russia on a number of resolutions, of course, India continued to abstain, only 39 countries are actually part of that sanctions regime, are part of the price cap coalition, are part of any of the strictures against Russia. Why have so many other countries stayed out? So India's case would be, we as part of the global South see that we are going to get hurt if we try to join your coalition against Russia. And we don't really want to. One of the cases that has also been made by the External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, has been that Europe cannot behave like its war is the whole world's war, but all the other world's problems are not their problem. But the real answer to your question, Tushar, I think would very simply be that the West's concerns about China and its concept of the world in the future, of the great power rivalry of the future between the US and China, essentially requires India to be in their corner. While it seems impossible to bring India into their corner when it comes to Russia, on China it seems that much easier because it is true. India's biggest threat strategically is from Beijing. China has not been a kindly neighbor. China has not only been extremely aggressive at various points of India's line of actual control, it has grabbed land over the last few years, although the government doesn't really want to talk about that. And it has continued a massive trade deficit with India, refusing to buy Indian products to kind of balance it out a little bit. So there has been no question that India has come around to the idea that its biggest strategic threat today is from China. In that scenario, the US particularly, and also Europe, that are looking for a coalition of the future that would range against China, need India to be in their corner. I think there's also a small amount of realization that if something is not going to be a success, why pin all your hopes, your own reputation on it? And if India is going to take such a strong stand, it might be pointless for US and Europe to take them on, Later this year, we'll see how it plays out when it comes to India's role as president of the G20, which it's going to hold the summit for in September this year. And it'll be interesting to see if India is able to bring the two sides together for a joint communique, just as Indonesia did last year. The signs aren't good.
Sure. And I think we touched on a little bit there, but from us, perhaps you could explain to our readers and our listeners even, kind of why India is seen to be in this kind of unique geopolitical position when it comes to the West. We've seen sort of favourable treatment kind of meted out to India, certainly from the US. I think about the S-400 defense systems that the US sanctioned Turkey, for example, from buying from Russia, but didn't sanction India. What does India have? What does India bring to the table that the US, and Europe are so interested in?
Well, I think India, and particularly the Modi government, bring three things to the table. One, of course, India, as it stands, it's the world's most populous country. It is the world's fastest growing country in terms of GDP growth. And it is a country that is seen, by and large, of being one of the in fact, one of probably the only such country of such a large population that remains, or for the moment at least, is a pluralistic, inclusive democracy. There's a lot of concern about where India is going as a democracy, but I think there is a sense in the West that India is a country that traditionally, historically, shares those values of, liberalism, of democracy, and of fair play, in a sense. So that's one of the reasons for India's sweet spot, but I would say this has always been India's sweet spot. It is always seen as a kind of country that people have a lot of goodwill for. Indians go around the world I think there's some 14 million Indians that are working in countries around the world. I think there's 18 million who are actually citizens of other countries of Indian origin. And they, by and large, have a very good reputation around the world. So that is India's traditional position. The second part of this is what I was discussing earlier, India's position vis-a-vis China, and the fact that a future geopolitical rivalry with China will require having a country as large as India on that Western side. So they don't want to say too much to upset. And I think the third part of this equation is that this particular government has shown that it can be very, very tricky in the face of any kind of criticism. Last year, I remember an American diplomat coming to Delhi and saying in no uncertain words, as you were pointing out, that there would be consequences for countries that supported Russia in this post-Ukraine situation. I mean, the Americans were practically demarched over it. India has shown that whenever there is criticism from the US, UK, Europe on any of the issues that they feel are their own internal matter, whether it is on trade with Russia, whether it is on human rights, whether it is on the freedom of media, NGOs and all the rest, that they will hit back very hard. So this is a government that it has been able to show these Western countries that it is willing to go that extra bit. And by and large, I find Western capitals don't really want to push India too far.
And that was Suhasini Haider, who gave us an excellent overview of the entire issue. I do encourage listeners to check out her YouTube show, Worldview with Suhasini Haider. For our next segment, we wanted to answer some of our listeners' direct questions about South Asia and the Ukraine conflict. Do remember, you can write to us at beyondtheindus@gmail.com or tweet at us at beyondtheindus1 on Twitter. But to help us with that, we have Sushant Singh, a friend of the podcast and Joe's go-to expert for all things strategy and geopolitics.
Mr. Singh is a senior fellow at the Centre for Policy Research, one of India's leading think tanks, which is based in Delhi, a lecturer at Yale University in the United States, author of several books, a regular columnist at the Hindu, and a former officer in the Indian Army. I mean, it's an impressive career. Welcome to Beyond the Indus, Sushant.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks a lot.
So we've spoken a lot already on this week's episode about India's policy towards Russia. But what explains the policies of other countries in the region, say Pakistan or Sri Lanka, who've also purchased oil from Russia and also abstained from voting against Russia at the United Nations? Kind of what might decide these countries' policies, Sushant?
So essentially, each country is unique by itself. So I'll take Sri Lanka first. So as you know, Sri Lanka used to get a lot of tourists from Russia. Its economy was dependent on, in a certain manner, on those Russian tourists which were coming. This, I think, second highest number of tourists from any country that Sri Lanka was getting was from Russia. Also, a large chunk of black tea that Sri Lanka was exporting was going to Russia. Sri Lanka was also dependent on Russia for wheat. Sri Lanka was also dependent on Russia for a lot of other goods. Both Russia and Ukraine were major trade partners for Sri Lanka. Also, Sri Lanka has very close ties with China as well as very close ties with India. And in that sense, because both India and China have been abstaining on the Russia issue, on the issue of Ukraine invasion, it's very logical that Sri Lanka has followed that line. In fact, like many other third world countries, many other countries of the global south, they do not wish to take on Russia or to antagonize Russia or to antagonize China in any manner. They think that this path where they do not antagonize either side, either the West or Sri Lanka or Russia or China, works best for them. As far as Pakistan is concerned, it's a very different case. Pakistan was a very close ally of the United States throughout the Cold War and even after the Cold War because of the military operations in Afghanistan. With Russia, it has had very limited ties. But because of the economic crisis that Pakistan finds itself in and the very poor state of its relationship with the United States, it's looking at Russia as only some kind of an economic partner which can provide it with some fuel, cheap fuel, which can provide it with some food and try and alleviate some of the concerns that it has. But also, it comes from the fact that China and Pakistan are very close allies, and China and Russia have great ties. But the Russian Deputy Prime Minister last month very clearly said, he clarified, there would be no military ties with Pakistan. There would only be economic ties with Pakistan. Another interesting fact about Pakistan is that Pakistan is one of those countries which is actually supplying ammunition to Ukraine through one of those bridges which have been created by London, by the UK. And that makes the situation pretty complicated. But because Russia wants to have as many economic partners as it can get at this point in time, it is overlooking those issues and continues to engage with Pakistan.
Yeah, I think that the Pakistan and Ukraine relationship is a particularly interesting one. And again, something I've learned a lot about in the last couple of weeks. I think since 2000, $1.6 billion worth of military equipment traded between Ukraine and Pakistan, which I think is something that has gone under the radar, I think, certainly for many even here in South Asia. And I look over the last week or so, and there's been a deal for Islamabad to send ammunition to Kiev, and in return, Kiev is sending, I think, parts of the Mi-7 helicopters. So this is an interesting relationship there. Then on the other hand, you have, it's the first shipment of oil will arrive in Pakistan later this month from Russia. It's been a Chinese brokered deal. As I'm sure many of our listeners will know, very strong relations between Islamabad and Beijing. You know, China's called Pakistan its all-weather partner, invested a huge amount of money in Pakistan. So interesting to see that China's now brokered that fuel deal for Pakistan. You know, a country which desperately needs cheap fuel, you know, enjoying the worst economic crisis in the country's history. As Mr. Ismail, who was a guest on our first podcast, kind of went into a lot of detail. So it's interesting to see countries in the region, I think, as you say, sort of playing both sides. You know, again, Sri Lanka is another country which looking to import cheap oil from Russia, you know, following its IMF bailouts, still struggling to recover economically. So they're very interesting, I think, across the region to see kind of countries abstaining and putting national interests first and feeling confident to do so and not risking kind of pushback from the US.
Yeah, that's true. Joe, actually, another interesting facet is that the main battle tank that the Pakistani army uses, which is the T-80UD, is actually a Ukrainian tank. That's the mainstay of Pakistan army, and Pakistan army, as you know, continues to dominate Pakistan's society, polity, economy in every possible way. And that could perhaps explain some of the affiliation that Pakistan feels for Ukraine and is going ahead with supplying the kind of ammunition that it is supplying.
So, listener of ours, Marcus Bellinger, wanted to get an update about the situation in Sri Lanka. We've already discussed Pakistan's polity crisis in the previous episode, but Sri Lanka has also gone through a significant crisis in its own country. So, what is the latest from Sri Lanka, and how are they coping with this geopolitical conflict in their economy?
Yes, so it's a very good question. We're always happy to hear from our listeners. So thank you for emailing in, Marcus. Yes, so Sri Lanka is a country that I spent an enormous amount of 2022 reporting from during the sort of peak of the crisis there, and it was just heartbreaking to see, you know, rampant inflation out of control, but still kind of massive sort of food insecurity. And Save the Children have called it a crisis. You know, reports of stunting amongst children widespread. And again, you know, almost like daily, weekly alerts from Sri Lankan hospitals. I regularly catch up with the medical association there and the senior figures. And in many hospitals, that medication isn't available. So Sri Lanka still has a long way to go. You know, a mass exodus of Sri Lankans as well, leaving the country, kind of record numbers of Sri Lankans applying for permits to leave. I think from India as well, we've seen kind of boats of Sri Lankans arriving in Tamil Nadu, particularly from the north of the country, the poorer part of Sri Lanka. Which we haven't seen, as far as I'm aware. Maybe Sushant, you could confirm on this since the civil war in Sri Lanka. It's a still very, very difficult situation in the country, but hopefully this is the start of things slowly improving.
Two things here. One is, in South Asia, Sri Lanka was the most prosperous country. There was no other country which had the kind of per capita GDP that Sri Lanka boasted of. And the second thing is that the Ukraine war has been a hammering blow to Sri Lanka, suffering from economic crisis even before the war happened. So the three major issues which came out, which had already come out during the economic crisis and which have been really hammered home in the Ukraine war is, as Joe said, the food issue, the fuel issue, and the fertilizer issue. And on all those three counts, Sri Lanka has really got the wrong end of the stick, so to speak. Inflation is very, very high. It's a humanitarian crisis. It is also a political crisis, because even today, there is no political answer to the problem that came in 2-3 years ago. And the political leadership is unable to inspire confidence in the people, or unable to find a solution to the problems that seem to be plaguing that country. it is true that since the civil war, this is the first time people have moved out in boats to come down to Tamil Nadu. And they're not really welcome in India in that sense. India does not have a refugee policy. India is not a signatory to the UN refugees. India does not welcome the Rohingyas from Myanmar. India does not welcome refugees from Tamil Nadu. India really does not welcome refugees from any country, including Afghanistan, who are suffering under the Taliban. And that continues to be applied to Sri Lankans as well, despite some of them being Tamils who share the same ethnicity as people belonging to the state of Tamil Nadu in India. So all in all, Sri Lanka is going through a tough situation.
Yes, it really is a sad situation. And again, we talk about kind of macro political mismanagement in Pakistan, but in Sri Lanka, I think even worse. I mean, as Sushant mentions, that the issue of fertilizer was a key one there, where the Sri Lankan government this outright banned the chemical fertilizers without warning. And farmers had obviously used the products for decades and decades, which led to a massive drop in yields. The war in Ukraine made things worse because Sri Lanka was a massive fertilizer importer from both Russia and Ukraine, and that flow of fertilizer was halted. So when the government then reversed the policy and let farmers use chemical fertilizers again, the price of fertilizers had skyrocketed. A story comes to mind from last week, which we covered at the Telegraph, which is, there's been controversy in Colombo over a proposed policy to send 100,000 monkeys that are a certain type of macaque monkey that is only found in Sri Lanka to China. The motivation seems to be for some extra foreign exchange, but environmentalists and activists in Sri Lanka are outraged by this and have said that the monkeys will end up in medical facilities or even in restaurants. So it does give an idea about how desperate situation is there when it comes to foreign exchange, when it comes to the economy, that these kind of policies are being considered. Yeah, one to keep an eye on for the rest of this year, I would say.
It's also interesting that the global attention has actually moved away from Sri Lanka because of the Ukraine crisis, and that's why it's a very important question that this listener has raised, because to pay attention to the crisis that is still brewing in Sri Lanka is at least in some manner is critical, is important, particularly for South Asia.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's from a sort of journalistic perspective, trying to get stories commissioned at the moment on Sri Lanka is very difficult because, as you say, that the world's focus is on Ukraine, and because the crisis has been so long-standing in Sri Lanka, trying to get stories out there, has been difficult recently. I think the Financial Times have done a couple of very good sort of deep dives on the continued crisis there. So for our listeners that are keen to read more about it, I would have a look there on the Financial Times. Moving on, Sushant, how would you explain the reaction of the Indian public to the war in Ukraine? I mean, I think one study that really stuck out to me was that in January, there was a poll done by Morning Consult, which showed that 38% of Indian adults blame Russia for the war, but combined 44%, so a higher percentage, blamed the US or NATO. I mean, why do you think that might be here in India?
So I think the reason may be twofold. One is at the elite level, it is the history of the Cold War and the relationship that the very close ties that India has had with Moscow all during the period while the United States was supporting Pakistan, and the fact that Indians always believed the Soviet Union or thereafter Russia is a country which would come to their aid, has created a narrative which has seeped in elite circles where the United States is not trusted even today, despite the fact that Indo-US ties have really improved and have become very strong. But even then, within the elite circles, I regularly hear voices that no, you cannot trust the US. Russia is an old friend. Russia is not going anywhere. We need to support it, etc. So that is at one level. And at the second level, which is very peculiar to India in some senses, that Mr. Putin is seen as this strongman, who has gone ahead and taken over Ukraine or is about to win over Ukraine, can get away by doing whatever it wants to do. And a lot of people in India, particularly Mr. Modi's supporters, see a parallel with him, that Mr. Modi could perhaps go and do the same thing in Pakistan. When the Ukraine war happened, there were posters put in the Connaught Circus area of Delhi, which actually said that, the way Putin is doing this Greater Russia, Mr. Modi would do Akhand Bharat or Greater India. So it is at two levels. One is at the elite level, where the memory of the Cold War and the very strong ties that India had with Soviet Union continue to influence them. And at a very popular level, or at the level of Mr. Modi's supporters, it is about the strongman image, the macho image, that they could go and do and get away with whatever such a strongman wishes to do.
Yeah, so Sushant, I have a follow-up to that question, which is, I guess the support for Russia is quite apparent. You see it in polls, you see it in the conversations happening in public spaces. But what I want to ask you is, are people comfortable, or is it accepted what's happening in Ukraine? Are people not moved, or at least a little bit shocked by, let's say, human rights violations that are happening in Ukraine? Or is everyone completely fine with, the actual war? What's your impression from what you've heard and read?
Yeah, my impression is exactly same as yours, that the scenes coming out of Ukraine do not seem to move the people at all. They have not resonated at all with large masses of Indians. There's absolutely no empathy or sympathy that you see for what's going on in Ukraine and the way Ukraine has been targeted. But it's just not about principles of sovereignty or territorial integrity, which India should be actually upholding very strongly because of what China is doing to India. But even then, the Indians do not seem to be moved by these scenes. If I were to be slightly politically incorrect, but Indians are not moved by the scenes of human rights violations within their own country, whether it be in Jammu and Kashmir, or be it in Nagaland or Manipur or elsewhere. So to expect a large section of Indians to be moved by scenes coming out of Ukraine is actually expecting a bit too much.
Right. And I think this brings us perfectly to our next question, which Deborah Pardes and Sudha Vardarajan from Swell have both asked about the Ukraine-India relation component of this. How have those relations been affected by the war, and how do they view us? And Sushant, I think that's a very interesting side of the story that's not really been explored that much. I mean, we've seen the Deputy Foreign Minister, Emina Sharapova, come to India and hold a lot of discussions and give press conferences. Ukraine and India have had relations before this in terms of defense, in terms of medicines exports. How have they evolved during the war? And what do you think Ukraine's view is of us and our participation in this entire conflict?
So the Ukraine-India ties have actually cooled down during the war, to the surprise of Ukrainians, almost to the level of anger. We saw the Ukrainian ambassador in New Delhi come out publicly and issue some very strong statements off the record, and in private meetings, they have voiced their anger, their frustration with the Indian side as to why is New Delhi not understanding what is being done to Ukraine. But at the same time, they want to continue with the kind of relationship they had with India earlier, whether it is in terms of facilitating the return of students who can go and study there. And as you probably know, more than 90% of the students which are from India have already gone back, or in terms of other kinds of support that India can provide, whether it is in terms of medicines or whether it is in terms of other humanitarian aid that Ukraine can get out of India. The ties have definitely cooled down, and the Ukrainians do recognize that India is, as a major country, as a big country, India is one of the countries they would have expected to stand by them, to do something for them, but it has not done anything for them. I have had Ukrainian officials approach me trying to understand as to why the Indian public opinion is against them. And that's something very, very hard to explain. They have also tried to influence Indian public opinion in some way, but they have not succeeded. And that challenge continues to remain. The basis of the ties is very thin, as you said. There's a little bit of trade which goes on, and there are a few military upgradation projects which are with Ukraine. But it is very small compared to the kind of ties or the gamut of ties that India has with Russia, particularly in the sphere of defense and now in terms of crude oil supplies.
Well, I guess relatively recently, in February, we had quite a senior Ukrainian official, the chief of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Ukraine, again calling on the US to impose sanctions on India for continuing to buy oil from Moscow. And I think these kind of calls fell on deaf ears. I mean, India is, we talk about China and Pakistan's relations, but India and US relations, they share so many strategic objectives in the Indo-Pacific. India is the US's big ally here. And I think that's something that Ukraine is going to have to accept. I don't see a hardening in the US's position towards India, something that we discussed quite a lot with our previous guest, Suhasini Haider. I mean, what do you think about that, Sushant? I mean, do you see any shifting at all kind of from the US's position towards India?
No, definitely not. I do not see any shifting of US positions In fact, US has made it amply clear that it is not going to push India on any issue whatsoever, whether it is buying of crude oil from Russia, whether it is, what has been described as laundromat, that you're buying crude from Russia and supplying it to Europe, making money in the bargain. So very clearly, the Biden administration has taken a call that they're going to overlook everything as long as India can cooperate with them, work with them in the Indo-Pacific and against China. Whatever the larger new emerging geopolitical scenario that is emerging, if India can work along with the United States, it's going to overlook every other issue, including Russia. And I do not see that any calls by Ukraine are going to change that calculation for the Biden administration. For them, China remains the biggest threat, and India is the biggest country which lies in Asia that can in some way, if not counter, at least provide a major obstacle to Chinese designs.
But Sushant, you do see some voices in the US that are saying now that perhaps India isn't as much of an ally as we think they are. For instance, I think Ashley Tellis put an article up on foreign policy, where he said that in the long run, US should not delude itself that India would rush to, join them in any military confrontation with China. So do you see a shift in the public discussion in the US as to India's long-term reliability as even a partner in the struggle against, let's say, Chinese influence?
No, absolutely right. This is a good question. Actually, Ashley wrote the piece in Foreign Affairs a couple of days back on the 1st of May. And the piece actually makes the argument that the US should temper its expectations. While India wants all the support that it can get from the US against China, it is not going to join any military activity that US may unleash against China. And I think Ashley's argument essentially comes from the fact that his understanding of India, his reading of India, and what India wants to do is very different from perhaps some of the officials in the Biden administration have. Will it force the Biden administration to change their policies towards India in the short term? No, it looks highly unlikely that these policies will be changed. But could a course correction take place over, let's say, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years post-Biden administration? Yes, because at some point in time, these questions will be asked in Washington, D.C. as to what does India bring to the table while asking for all that it is asking from us to deal with China. And I think those questions, Ashley has in some way preempted those questions and raised those questions at a time when the geopolitical circumstances have changed. So the US-China relationship was very different 20 years back when India and the US had started interacting or their relationship was still developing. 20 years down the line, the US-China relationship is radically different. They're completely different apart. So the expectations of India from the US or US from India have also changed because of these changed circumstances. And I think this is what Ashley pointed out in that piece in Foreign Affairs.
So many thanks to Sushant Singh. I believe he was quite direct and straightforward about the reality of the war's impact on South Asian countries. So Joe, what are your impressions? How do you think things are going to change moving forward?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that really the war in Ukraine has heralded an era of multipolarism. We're seeing countries across the world, rather than kind of falling into one camp or another, as we saw during the Cold War, and increasingly playing both sides for their own advantages. India being a great example of that, taking advantage of cheaper Russian oil to drive economic growth, then also cooperating with America, Japan, and Australia when it comes to the immediate threat of China in its neighborhood.
Given the wider geopolitical stakes at play here, one can see why sanctions may not be the most effective tool to convince the global south to come on board. But I do hope to see policies that better align with the interests of all stakeholders involved. And the price cap for oil, for instance, is a great example of this. Let's hope we see more of these policies in the future.
So that's all we've got time for on this week's episode of Beyond the Indus. But we hope you'll join us in a fortnight's time. Have a great week.